And here we are, just a few days after what would have been Rilke's 149th birthday. So next year is a big year, the 150th. There will be a lot of Rilke things happening, including a 4-week course I'm teaching at the Camden Adult Education program at the high school. So if you'd like to spend 4 Thursday evenings going deeper with me and a very interesting group of people who've already registered, then join us at the Camden Hills Regional High School. Did I get that right?
Yeah. January is coming up fast.
January, it's coming up fast, yeah. So Sing the Gardens, that's an admonition. Well, it's written as an admonition. It really is more of an invitation in one of the sonnets, which we'll end our program tonight with. Sing the gardens, my heart, that you don't know. An extraordinary sonnet, an extraordinary poem, and really an extraordinary invitation to celebrate the things that are beyond what we know. Celebrate things that are unknown to us, that are cherish the things that we've not seen, but that we might desire to see. And in no time is an invitation like that to me as important as it is right now, as we face into a very uncertain future, not just in our country, but in the world, with wars and rumors of war, with who knows what will happen, given the change of administration. And I think it's a time when we need one another to face this future as communities of courage, communities of witness. As Rilke writes in one of the elegies, speak and bear witness. Speak and bear witness. Lift your voice and bear witness to what you know is true and good and beautiful. And we'll do that together in the next years. So, in a letter, a beautiful collection of letters that Rilke wrote in the last year and a half of his life. He had met at one of his readings in Zurich, a young woman named Antoinette de Bonstetten. She was in her late teens, and she was a gardener. And he was begging her, inviting her over and over again to come to his little castle, his Chateau de Mouzot. Small, we'll see a picture of it in a few minutes. A small stone tower built in the 13th century that became his home for the longest period of being in one place since his childhood. It's in the upper Rhone Valley, in the Valais part of Switzerland, French-speaking Switzerland. And there, in this almost windowless chateau, he wrote among the most significant poems of modern German literature, and I would say modern European literature, the Sonnets to Orpheus, and he finished the Duino elegies. And that will be the subject of the evening tonight. But in one of those letters to young Antoinette, and I should add, it's an interesting story about her. She was so moved. They met once. She was able to meet him one more time before he died. And these letters are the intimate letters, almost like a father to a daughter. 40 years difference, or 30 years difference between the two of them. He hoped that she would come and help him finish the garden around the chateau, which was wild and had been untended for a generation. That never happened because of his death. And when he died on December 29th, 1926, she was so moved by the news that she came with her mother to this little village in Caron, where he was buried for the funeral. There were only a handful of people who could come. She came because she lived close by and happened to be home with her mother for the holidays. We need art and still. I love that. This is a good translation that just came out in a book called Letters Around the Garden. Letters Around the Garden, translated by Will Stone from the French. You see, Rilke grew up hearing French. His mother knew French, but he only really began to learn French when he went to Paris at his new wife's encouragement. She gave him a letter of invitation to Rodin, with whom she had studied. They became partners in a way for 2 different periods, Rodin and Rilke. Rilke as his personal secretary, during his second stay in Paris. But French became the language of his latter years. He wrote a whole volume of poems in French. Magnificent poems, simple, but magnificent poems. Rilkean poems. He did to French what Rilke did to German. He did to the French language what he did to the German language, which was to seduce it into a kind of beauty that's almost unimaginable to describe. You experience it. You can't describe it. You experience it.
Mark, is that book also available in French?
It is. It was published in 1997 in French for the first time. The woman who wrote the letters didn't give them up until near the end of her life. She kept them as a treasure. They were too dear to her. Finally, when she gave them up, they were published immediately in French, and then just this last year, translated and published in English. We need art and still. Or we need art or all the resources and experiences of childhood. And those are two of Rilke's great themes, art and childhood. And for him, these are not different things. These are just different ways into the same thing, into that tender place of innocent experience, of encountering the world not with language, not with categories, not with all of our doubts and anxieties, but in the direct way that children experience the world, immediately. And some of the poems here are really written as paeans to childhood, as exaltations of childhood. I'll say more about that as the evening goes on. And we need the constant contribution of so many things to support ourselves alone. A willing house, a garden, innocent and giving. The curve of birds in the air. Who could come up with that line? The curve of birds in the air. Winds, the rains, memories, and the calm of a starry firmament stretching to the infinite. All this just so a human being can settle with his heart. What a gorgeous, powerful, evocative claim. All of these things, art, childhood, a garden, the winds, the rain, all the things around us, the physical world of which we are a vital part. All of these things that stretch to the infinite so that we can settle with our own heart, which was Rilke's great theme. How to settle with our heart. How to make sense of the world, not through our rational mind, which is important. I mean, you can't get the shopping done, or pay your bills, or take care of the day-to-day necessities without that rational part of the mind. But that won't tell us who we are. It won't tell us why we're here. And it certainly won't tell us what's ahead. Well, who is this man? Born in 1875. Here's a painting by the son of the great Pasternak, the great poet, Leonid Pasternak, painted shortly after Rilke's first visit to Moscow in 1899. He's 24 years old. And you can see the Kremlin, the old Moscow. When we hear the Kremlin, we think, oh, the Stats, the government, the Soviet government or the Russian government. Well, it's so simply the old part of Moscow. And it's full of churches, monastic churches. And when Rilke arrived in 1899, in April of 1899, the first thing that they did, he and Lou, with his lover at the time, 14 years his senior, a magnificent woman, a philosopher, an artist, a writer, a novelist, a poet. Lou Andreas Salome. She'd written the first significant monograph on Friedrich Nietzsche. She was the first person to actually see the genius of Nietzsche. He was scorned among his colleagues, and they met. And Nietzsche fell in love with her and proposed marriage. And she turned it down. Smart move.
Yeah.
And she went on to this intimate relationship with Rilke. They were lovers for 3 years. They were inseparable for 3 years. She broke it off eventually, and but they remained friends. And she was his mentor. I would even say his midwife for the rest of his life. She coaxed the genius out of him, or helped him see it when he'd lost sight of it. Something every artist has to have. You don't need appreciative critics. What you need is a mentor, a midwife, to remind you of your vocation when you are downtrodden and have forgotten the way. Here he is a year before his death. Leukemia had already set in, and he struggled for the last year and a half, off and on in health sanatoriums, where he finally died in December 1926. Those eyes, blue, clear, striking blue. People wrote of him that when they were in his presence, he felt that they felt that his eyes were just boring into their soul, not in a bad way. That he could see into people's hearts somehow. But he had a terrible childhood, an anxious, heavy one. Here he is. He was born and christened as René Karl Wilhelm Johann Joseph Maria Rilke. All of these Austrian kings, this whole lineage of power, right? But with a girl's name. Well, it could have been a boy's name, but in French it would have been more often a girl's name, René. His mother had lost a daughter a year before, and she longed to have a daughter, which she never did have. She dressed him as a girl, which wasn't that unusual in the times, but she also manicured him as a girl, which was difficult for her. And finally, his father got the upper hand and sent him off to a military school, which crushed him as an 11-year-old boy. So from 11 to 16, he was in a military school in Austria. He begged his parents to be released from this terrible situation. They finally relented. He took entrance exams to university. He was admitted, but he never finished. He never finished anything in any school. He never finished a high school. He never finished a university degree. He was a self-taught genius, learning enough Russian to translate, not only to translate from Russian to German, but to write in Russian. Apparently the poems aren't that good. But the courage of doing it is remarkable. And of course, at the end of his life, he produced a marvelous volume of poems and many, many letters in French. Well, there's Prague in the late 19th century. And here's the Carolus Bridge. I often think that it's likely that his mother was walking along on one side of this bridge in his childhood. And on the other side, born 8 years behind him, Franz Kafka's mother is pushing Franz in a little pram. Hard to imagine. And it's amazing that nobody's written a story about this, a novel or a short story. But they grew up in the same place, Kafka in the Jewish part of town, and Rilke in the Catholic part. And this is truncating a long story, but this is the famous castle, the Duino Castle. Ute and I finally made it there a couple of years ago. It's a spectacular palace on this remarkable face of rocks, 200 or 300 feet down to the Adriatic Sea, just north of Trieste in Italy. And it was here in 1912, Rilke was there for the winter, that he, one night, walking this balustrade with this drop to the ocean on a stormy, windswept night, he claimed that he heard screaming out over the wind, and who, if I screamed out, would hear me among the ranks of angels. He knew this was the beginning of what would be his great life project, the elegies. He didn't know how many or what form, but he finished 2 of them in the next couple of months and dabbled in the next few years at trying to finish them unsuccessfully. Fragments are all he finished. And then came a war, which shattered him, utterly shattered him. He lost his sense of being a European. He wasn't German, he was Austrian. And he eventually, strangely even, felt so moved to stand with his country that he enlisted in the military, was brutalized by basic training, failed at it, and finally was posted to a desk job in Vienna, where he was told to write heroic stories from the front to encourage young men to enlist. He'd never seen the front, and this was shattering to him. He finally was released. He had a psychological breakdown. His friends begged for his money. He spent the next few years living quietly in Munich and trying to find a way to put his mind and his heart back together. It finally happened when he discovered in 1921 this tower castle, a picture taken a few years ago near Sierre in the Valais of Switzerland. It doesn't look now any different than it did then. This is a picture from his time. Here is Rilke with the castle, the Chateau de Musat in the background. One of a handful of photographs we have from this last period of his life. Dressed immaculately, somewhat priggish. A three-piece suit always, starched shirt always, a cane since he was a young man always, and often spats on his shoes as he has here, always. I'm not sure if we'd meet him walking down the street, what we would do today, but we would certainly smile to see such a thing. Well, those last years are closely connected with a woman he'd fallen in love with in this last stretch of his life. He called her his Merlin, Marlene. Her name was Baladine Klazowska. She came from a Slavic German family. They met in Paris when they were both living there in the early 1900s. And she was married, not very happily, but she was married. Eventually, she and her husband separated, and she fell in love with Rilke. And her very talented son was already a painter. He simply went by the name Balthus. If you know anything about expressionist art, you'll know the name Balthus. And Rilke helped Balthus publish a small collection of images of his paintings, along with Rilke's appreciative introductory essay, a kind of exhibition catalog. Well, she was instrumental in his life. Here they are at the entrance to the chateau. And she gave him an etching by a postcard of an etching by the Italian artist Cornelianus of Orpheus. Here playing the lute as the lute would have been played in the late Middle Ages, more like a violin in our own experience. And he's mourning. You can see the grief in his face because he's lost his beloved Eurydice, a story that many of you will know from the opera, from plays, or from wherever. She'd given him a French translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses, which has a whole section on Orpheus. And Orpheus, of course, after the horror of losing his wife to death, she's carried down to the underworld, begs Hades to allow her to be released. And he does under one condition, that in leading her up, he can only lure her with his music. And if he ever turns around to see if she's there, he loses her forever, which is exactly what happens. At the last moment, he no longer feels her hand on his shoulder because she's reaching into the world, into the earth again. And when he turns, he loses her, she's gone. So what does he do? He spends the rest of his life enchanting the animals and the trees and the rocks with his music. So Rilke writes these sonnets to Orpheus, this God-human figure who bridges what he calls the Doppelbereich, the two realms of earth and the beyond, of life and death, beyond death. And shortly around Christmas, 1921, Rilke received a letter from a woman named Gertrude Uckermark-Knupp, the mother of young Vera, a friend of his daughters. Rilke had one daughter, born in 1901. And when Rilke's wife, Clara, moved with their daughter, Ruth, to Munich, she met, as a young teenager, this young woman, and they became the closest of friends. Well, Vera was already widely acknowledged as a dancer. She apparently had incredible talent, and people gathered to see this young woman dance until in her 14th year, she began to feel the onset of the disease that killed her, the same disease that killed Rilke 5 years later, leukemia. She lost the use of her legs. And so she, not to be defeated, she took up drawing and painting. And when she could no longer even hold a brush because her arms were wearied by the disease, she took to song. Spent the last stretch of her life singing, making as much beauty as she could with song. Rilke was so moved that her mother, Gertrude, sent an account of Vera's last 2 years, of this heroic life committed to making art against the greatest of odds, the odds of a fatal disease and an impending death. And he was so moved by this that when the sonnets began to come to him, like a rush, he says. See if this is February 1922. Sorry. In February of 1922, Rilke experienced what he later described as a savage creative storm, finishing the Duino elegies and writing the sonnets to Orpheus, which came as a torrent, he writes. Writing to Lou, Andreas, Salome after he'd finished them, he said, I found myself hurled into a boundless storm, a hurricane of the spirit. And whatever inside me is like thread and webbing framework, it all cracked and bent, no thought of food. In 3 days, he finished the first 26 sonnets, 3 days. He said he heard them as if they were dictated inside of his head. And he turned then to finish the last 5 elegies, bringing the total to 10. And when those were finished, in the middle of the month, on the 10th of the month, 29 more sonnets poured forth, making the 55 that we have today. A remarkable thing. And if the elegies are they're unrhymed. It's one of the only unrhymed things Rilke ever wrote. They're magnificent. I've included 2 of them in my edition because they were written right between the first 26 and the last 29. And these 2, the 8th and the 9th, are just majestic. They're declarations of what it is to live into what Rilke called the open, to live into a spaciousness of life. And they're a kind of celebration of living in the here-ness of life, das Hiesige, what's here and now, not what's then or back there. And it's funny because we use the word then in 2 ways, don't we? It's the not present. It's then in the past, or then I will go to then I will go to Boston. But then I went to Boston. It's interesting. That then takes us away from the present. And Rilke said it's that move away from the present that's our only vocation in our life. That's all we're really here to do, is to find the courage and the conviction to live into the fullness of our present life. Well, here's Vera, and 2 of the sonnets, the next to last in both of the sequences, as he finally arranged them, are dedicated to her. They're all about her. Some of you were at the presentation I gave a week ago at the Harbor Square Gallery, and you heard me talk about the first of these, number 25 from the first part. This is the next to the last sonnet, number 28 from the second part. And here it goes. Oh, come and go. Oh, come be. A strange beginning of the sonnet, written to a young woman who'd come and gone. would come into his life and had gone. Except that he's quite sure that she's very present, that her presence could not be contained by death. He ends that last, the poem that I worked on the last time with some of you, from the first part, number 25, by speaking about her going through the open gate. That was his image of death. Not the closed door, but the open gate. And it's an open gate that is open in both directions. So the dead are no longer, are not gone from us. They're simply present differently. And you know that in your own grief. Those we've lost in death are not, they're not gone. They may be absent physically, but sometimes there's even a stronger kind of presence because we know we can't meet them physically, but we can always greet them within our hearts, which we do. Oh, come and go. You almost still a child, a strange construction, almost still. Fast noch ein Kind. Almost still a child. Extend the dance figure, the dance move for an instant. In a pure constellation, one of those dances within which we momentarily surpass nature, muffled in its ordering. For it roused itself into full hearing only when Orpheus sang. And you start to feel in Rilke as these poems unfold that where is Orpheus singing? Wherever there's singing, it's Orpheus, he says. In our lives, when we sing, it's Orpheus, right? It's this God-human, this one who moves back and forth beyond the realms of death, who meets us in the beauty of music and the arts and poetry. For it roused itself only into full hearing when Orpheus sang. You were still the one moved from that time and a bit disconcerted when a tree patiently pondered, following you by listening. What a weird, marvelous image. Look, I wrote about these poems a year after I finished them to somebody who wrote and said, I don't understand these poems. So, well, first of all, that's not a problem because it's not about understanding them. It's about experiencing them. And that's a different thing because we experience far more than we understand, right? And in point of fact, our work in this life is not to understand, it's to experience. Well, Rilke knew that, and he knew that somehow this image, when a tree patiently pondered, following you by listening, for him the world was alive. Everything was alive. Everything was connected. Everything. Trees could listen. And birds could sing as they do. And we could learn to be like Orpheus, singing and listening. You knew the place still where the lyre raised itself, sounding the extraordinary center. You see that image of Orpheus that he has in his mind, raising the lyre to be able to play it. For this, you practice these lovely steps. Vera, he's writing to her. For this, you practice these lovely steps and hope someday to turn your friends, and he uses a masculine friend, not the feminine. He's writing here about himself. And hoped someday to turn your friend's gait and gaze toward the unbroken celebration. It's a gorgeous poem. A celebration of what it means to live as an artist and to receive the gift of the arts in one's life. But it's not about becoming poets. It's much deeper than that. It's becoming an artist with your own life. And that image at the very end, the unbroken celebration, is what these sonnets are all about. If in the elegies he mourns, M-O-U-R-N-S, he mourns so many things that are opposing life, in the sonnets, he simply gives himself exuberantly to what life can offer in all of its fullness, the unbroken celebration. One more from the first sequence, number 19. For the world changes as swiftly as the cloud forms. For the world changes as swiftly. I love the image of the cloud forms. I mean, it just takes you right there, isn't it? A balmy summer day, wherever you find yourself in Camden or Rockport, wherever you live, you on Zoom, and you're looking up in the sky. When I was much younger, with young children, we used to summer in Tenants Harbor. And one of the things I loved doing with my daughters was we had a little cabin we rented right down on the water on Hart's Neck side of the harbor. And we'd sit out often for hours in the afternoon just watching clouds and telling stories about what we saw. Didn't you do that as a child or with a child? You still do? Yeah, I wrote a poem about this and published it about the cloud watch. I called it the cloud watch with my daughters. I still feel myself there on that meadow by that harbor. These beautiful little girls, one on each side of my arms, telling stories about what we saw: a dragon, an elephant, cow, bicycle, whatever. Right? And they're moving all the time, which is what children love. It's changing. The story is changing all the time. So the world changes as swiftly as a cloud forms. All that's perfected returns home to the most ancient of things. Beyond the change and passing, further and freer, your primal song, Orpheus, endures. God with the lyre. Beyond the change and passing, further and freer, your primal song, dein Vorgesang, hard to translate, the song before, the original song, the primal is how I finally decided to render it. That took years of just thinking through. I'm still not sure it's the way it should be phrased, but Vorgesang doesn't exist as a word. There isn't such a thing as a Vorgesang. One lovely translation calls it the overture. That's not quite right. It's something before the songs are made. Primal song. Your primal song endures, God with a lyre. Suffering has not been understood. This is our situation. We don't really understand what suffering is. Nor has love been learned. And what distances us in death is not unveiled. Only the song, Über Land, above the land, over the land, hallows and celebrates. That's pure Rilke. Only the song. That's for him all that really mattered in life, is catching that song and giving voice to it. Realizing that in a sense, we stand now where Orpheus stood, in the middle of our griefs, our losses, the tragedies that we face, the suffering we endure, that our work, our vocation, is to give voice to that song. There is nothing else to do. Well, we're getting to the gardens, I promised you. And in a letter of November 12th, 1901, it's just, he wrote more than 10,000 letters we have stamped. They fill some 30 volumes, and every few years another volume comes out of letters that have been discovered, often in the States, and are turned over to the Rilke archives, which are now in Marbach in Germany, a great center of literary estates, a foundation. This is written when he was, how old? 26 years old. And he spent a part of every day writing letters. It wasn't that unusual back then. In fact, he had one pen that he used just for writing letters. And he had a second pen that he used just for writing poetry. He never mixed them up. These two pens. At a standing writing desk, he had such a terrible back that he was tormented with pain if he tried to sit down. Some of you will appreciate that for any length of time. So he had a writing desk. It's one of the few things he carried with him, and he was always traveling for most of his life, until these last 5 years at Roosevelt. Always traveling. He took his writing desk, which collapsed, folded up, and he's, of course, the pens. Most people do not realize how beautiful the world is, and how much radiance reveals itself in the tiniest things. And that's just a great lie, isn't it? And we have to include ourselves in that, or at least I do. Maybe you're purer than I am. But I often don't realize I'm so busy reading the latest terrible news about what's happening in our country or in the world, right? And it leaves you with a heavy heart, and it's important to face those things, but it's not all there is. And Rilke was very mindful of that. Most people do not realize how beautiful the world is and how much radiance reveals itself in the tiniest things, in some flower, in a stone, tree bark, or a birch leaf. Grown-ups, being preoccupied with business and worries and tormenting themselves with all kinds of petty things, gradually lose the capacity to see the riches of children when they are attentive and good, and I would add, and safe, right, and secure, immediately notice and love with their whole heart. For most children, young children, there is no such thing as yesterday. And tomorrow is also another imaginary fantasy. What they have is today, they have now, right? They have this moment right now. And yet the greatest beauty would be achieved if everyone could remain like such children, simple and innocent in feeling. And if they did not lose the capacity for delighting tenderly in a birch leaf or a peacock's feather or the wing of a hooded crow, as in a great mountain range or a magnificent palace. What is small is not small in itself, just as that which is great is not great. Vast and eternal beauty passes through the entire world and is justly distributed over small and large things alike. And I think this is really at the heart of Rilke's vocation as a poet. To see beauty in the little things. It's easy to see beauty in huge, spectacular things, right? The great moments, the great landscape, whatever it might be. But he found himself really increasingly drawn to places that were not evidently beautiful, where you had to learn to look to see the beauty that was there, the radiance in the tiniest of things. And one of those things, for gardeners, is a flower called, anybody know what it is? There are hundreds of varieties.
Anemone?
It's an anemone. Yeah, it's an anemone. It's the anemone. And there are so many kinds. It's an amazing flower, a simple flower, really. And what Rilke was so drawn to with the anemone is that at night, the anemone is one of those flowers that closes up. And then in the day, it opens again. He was so moved by this. I was speaking about over the weekend on another program about his relationship with Lou Andreas Salome. I mentioned her earlier, his lover, early on, who remained his confidant, his mentor, his midwife. And he wrote a letter to her in 1914, just as the war was breaking out. He was overwhelmed with anxiety about what was happening to Europe and what might destroy everything that he thought would remain intact. And he remembered, he said, he writes here, he says, I remember when I was in Rome. He doesn't say when. I was in Rome one night in a garden, and I saw a field, a whole group of anemones, but there was one that wasn't closed. He said, I realized that's me. I can't close myself from the darkness. I'm so vulnerable to the terrors that are besetting the world. I wish I could close myself away. Now Lou writes back. He was at the time in Paris. She writes back 5 days later. I don't know how the post was so good back then. The letters go back and forth in a day. Anyway, she writes back a few days later and says, well, but remember, Dinah, that your vocation is for all of the rest of us who don't have the courage to face the darkness. You're doing for us what we often fail to do ourselves. And we love the anemone throughout his whole life. And he writes a sonnet to the anemone. And he does it with the strangest language imaginable. He makes up all of these words, which was his way. This is from the second sequence, number 5. And it begins Blumenmuskel, which is not a word. I mean, it's two nouns pushed together. So I've hyphenated. He doesn't hyphenate anything, just Blumenmuskel, flower muscle. And you realize, I mean, he's looking at the anemone, he says, look, it's got a muscle in there. There must be a muscle in the flower. It's a flower muscle, right? The anemone. Flower muscle that opens little by little the meadow morning of the anemone until the bright sky's polyphonous light pours itself forth into her womb. Oh my God, right? I mean, that's an extraordinary, what is a polyphonous light, first of all, right? What is a polyphonous light? A many sounding light. Synesthesia, right? Those who have synesthesia, he apparently had. So he could hear the light. He could hear the light. Flower muscle that opens little by little the meadow morning of the anemone until the bright sky's polyphonous light pours itself into her womb. That's gorgeous, isn't it? What a way of looking at this flower that he was so mesmerized by. Flexed muscle of unending welcome, poured into the quiet, here's another made-up word, star bloom. At times, so overpowered with abundance that the sunset's silent gesture can hardly return to you the leaves' widely sprung back edges. I hope you never go into a garden in the same way once you've heard this poem. Look at all the things happening out there. In your little garden, I'm not talking about the Booth Bay Botanical Garden, Versailles. No, your garden, the one next to your house where you live. You resolve, you, anemone, resolve and power of how many worlds? We, die Gewaltsamen, the violent ones, we endure longer. But when, in which of all our lives will we finally be open and receive it? A haunting question. We're the violent ones. We're the ones disregarding the sanctity of our gardens, of the earth, of one another. But when, in which of all our lives, your lives and mine, will we finally be open and receive it? This poem.
It is like the when the force through the green fuse drives the flower.
The force that the green fuse drives the flower. Beautiful, beautiful. Flower muscle that opens little by little the meadow morning of the anemone To the bright skies, polyphonous light pours itself forth into her womb, flexed muscle of unending welcome, poured into the quiet star bloom. A time so overpowered with abundance that the sunset's silent gesture can hardly return to the leaves' widely sprung back edges. You resolve and power of how many worlds. We, the violent ones, we endure longer, but when, in which of all lives, will we finally be open and receivers? Well, we'll close with the invitation to sing the gardens. I told you we'd get there. And I must say, when I read through these poems many, many years ago, I didn't have much of a sense of what's going on. And I was comforted when I discovered, not that long ago, an obscure letter of Rilke's, written to someone who had, I've mentioned this earlier, who wrote to him and said, I don't understand the sonnets. And he writes back and says, well, that's okay. You're not supposed to understand them. You should experience them. And he said, what is required to experience these sonnets is the same thing that was required of me to write them. Receptivity, vulnerability, opening yourself without demanding to understand, to direct your mind, or let the images, the lines, strangely luminous, gorgeous German, to let it just work its way on your heart, eventually rule your mind. Well, this poem needs a little bit of explanation. Not a lot, but a little, because there are a couple things coming in the poem. One thing you need to know is that Lou Andreas Salome, when Rilke fell in love with her, was already married to Friedrich Andreas. And he desperately wanted to marry her, and she was firmly resolved against it, until she finally told him, I'll marry you if you agree that we will never have a sexual relationship. And he was so smitten by her that he said, okay, I'll do it. And they never did, as far as we know. And she had a series of lovers. And sometimes, as with Rilke, they traveled together. That must have been awkward, somewhat difficult. And there were moments when he became furious with her because of these relationships. But they remained deep friends. And she wrote a memoir after his death, in which she devotes the last 3 chapters to her tender love of this man who provided something for her, friendship, not physical things, but provided friendship for her and respect that she said, I never could have found in any other way. Remarkable. Remarkable. He was an Iranist. He was a professor. He apparently knew 10 languages, including Arabic, Farsi, and spent years early in his career, before he and Lou met, in Iran, well, it wasn't Iran then, in Persia, studying the ancient culture, living in places, among them Isfahan, the city in present-day Iran, and Shiraz, another city in present-day Iran. And both of those places were renowned for the beauty, the opulence of the gardens, and particularly in Isfahan, the fountains, the water fountains that were all through the city, that were richly elaborated with Islamic art, right? With the non-pictorial art. The Quran descriptions came from the Quran, etched into the stones. Well, Rilke was told about, he must have shared this love of Persia over the course of their life together. And Rilke had a deeply respectful relationship with him. There was no envy or jealousy at all on Rilke's side. and apparently not on his side. Probably easier after he and Lou broke off their love relationship. But he deeply wanted to go to Iran, and he knew when he wrote this poem that he would never get there. He was already feeling the beginnings of the illness. He didn't know what it was. It wasn't diagnosed until a week before he died, in the middle of December 1929, 26. So that's one thing you need to know. The other thing is that he lived in a castle tower made of stone in the 13th century. No central heating, stone floors, stone walls, stone ceilings. Winter, can you describe one word to describe what that would be like? What would be the word? Oh, cold or miserable or, I mean, choose your word. Deeply cold. And what were hanging on the walls there, we know this from some of his letters, were carpets, Persian carpets, which was quite common at that time. You couldn't wallpaper, you couldn't insulate in any other way, but they would hang huge carpets against the wall to keep the heat in and to keep the damp out. And he had these carpets, probably silk carpets, because he had very high taste. He had a low income, but he had wealthy friends, and he had very expensive taste. Anyway, this tower castle was paid for by one of his patrons, who was so keen that Rilke would find a place to finish his life's work. But he first rented it, and after a year, when it was clear Rilke wanted to stay there, he bought it for him. Rilke never owned it, but he bought it so that it could be Rilke's permanent dwelling place, which he enjoyed for 5 years before his death. Those are the two things, and the third is this. I'll pass it around. I'm sorry to say it's not Murano glass, but Rilke went as a 22-year-old. He wanted to go with Lou to Italy to do his great trip. They'd just fallen in love. She couldn't go at the last minute, and so his mother said, well, I'll take you. Probably not the companion he really needed. But they visited in Venice the Murano Glassworks. And some of you will have gone to the Murano Glassworks, so you can imagine it. So this is a small version of something Rilke describes, a garden poured into glass. But you can't touch, you can look at it. This is on my desk all of the time. And when the sun hits it, I just can only smile. It's so beautiful, but it's untouchable. So those three images you need for this poem. So here we go, the final poem. Sing the garden is my heart that you don't know. He's never going to get to Iran, to Persia, to see those gardens. Like gardens poured into glass, clear, unattainable. Fountains and roses of Isfahan or Shiraz, sing them blissfully and praise them, each incomparable. It's an extraordinary poem. To sing, I mean, what does it mean to sing a garden? I'm not sure. But it has something to do with praise, something to do with an exaltation, something to do with seeing a beauty that's so overwhelming to you that all you can do is smile and sing and laugh and delight. Sing, the garden is my heart that you don't know, like gardens poured into glass, clear and unattainable. Fountains and roses of Isfahan or Shiraz, sing them blissfully and praise them, each incomparable. Show my heart that you can never be without them. What a beautiful phrase. Show my heart that you can never be without them, that their ripening figs have you in mind, that you consort with their winds that rise to your face among the blooming branches. This stanza cost me 10 years to get it sort of right. I mean, working on it over and over again. The German is so exquisite. Avoid the mistaken notion that anything is lacking in the decision you've made. To be. That's all you need to do. To be. Not to have, or to want, or to desire to be. Silken thread, here it comes. You're woven into the weave. Your life is like a silk. It's not the weave. It's not the carpet, the whole tapestry. It's one silken thread that belongs to what Rilke came to call, at this part of time in his life, das Ganze, the whole. If he were among us, he would say the problem with so much self-help literature that's in all your bookstores is that you're trying to fix yourself and make yourself whole. You can never do that. You can see that you belong to the whole. That's enough. Like a silken thread woven into the weave. Whatever image you're inwardly joined to, if only a moment in this anguished life, feel that the whole, the praiseworthy carpet is met. A gorgeous poem. Whatever image is inside of you, whatever image you've inwardly made your own, you've only a moment in this anguished life, in this difficult life. Feel that the whole, the praiseworthy carpet is met. I love this poem. And I think I'm only beginning to understand it as I get older. As I realize that my work is not to become whole, or perfect, or achieve anything in particular, but to bear witness to the one thing I can do, that you can do, which is to see how you belong to a larger wholeness that depends on you in part, not in whole, but in part. And in that part, to realize that you have a song that only you can sing. Sing the Gardens. Thank you very much. So, thank you. I think what we'll do, instead of having questions, and so you've been so gracious and present, thank you. And those of you on Zoom, hi. We have refreshments. There's some hot cider, there's some cookies, there are other things to drink. I'll hang around here. There are books if you want to meet Allison. I'm happy to sign it. But my main word to you is thank you for coming, for being here, and for the song that is your life, the one that you've been made to carry. And let's keep that song alive together in this community, in these times. Thank you very much.
Thank you. See what you've done.
With